Hello and welcome back to The Pisky Trap, a series where we explore the folklore, history and legends from across Devon and Cornwall. I hope that you're all well and you're having a lovely summer so far. First off, a big thank you to everyone who came along to the live talks exploring Cornish witchcraft over the past few months. It was lovely to see so many of you there, so thank you very much to those of you that came along. Some exciting news is that I'll be delivering another series of talks this autumn, exploring ghosts and the Cornish landscape. We'll be looking at a range of local ghost stories and their connections to particular places in the landscape around Cornwall. So lots of spooky stories for Halloween time. Tickets are now available for those, and I'll pop links below to those events in the show notes. Before we get started, I have to say thank you to Dr. Rupert White, who recently sent me a copy of his fantastic book, Physic and Folk Medicine, A History of Healthcare in Cornwall, which is a fascinating read, and I highly recommend grabbing yourself a copy if you're interested in the topic. Also, a shout out to Paul, who's been listening to the series and was kind enough to send me a gift of some craft beer. So, thank you very much, Paul. That was very, very kind of you. And lastly, if you've been listening and you're enjoying the series, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe and spread the word around if you can. It all helps to keep this project growing and developing. And if you're able, and you'd like to support the project further, you can check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/The Pisky Trap. Right, as this episode is going to be a bit of a long one, let's crack straight on with it. I'm not going to lie, I'm excited about this one. Those of you who've been listening for a while now will know that I'm a fan of a good local ghost story. And in this episode, there are several ghost stories and local tales, all connected with one particular place. We're going to be heading to West Cornwall and the area around Golville, which is near Penzance. Some of you may remember that there were a couple of episodes, such as the one on ghost layers and the white hair, where a particular character cropped up a couple of times, who was known as Wild Harris of Kenegie. And it's this place, Kenegie, an old manor and estate at Golville, that we're going to be looking at. This topic was something that I'd sort of had on the back burner for a while, when this Wild Harris character kept cropping up, and I made a sort of mental note to myself of going, I'll look into that further at some point. And of course, I then got distracted with other research and other projects. It was really only a few weeks ago, when I began the prep and research for the upcoming talks this autumn, that I came across the topic again. And not really knowing much about the history of Kenegie Manor, I decided to get in touch with Crescent Kerno. So a shout out to all the lovely team in the archive at Crescent Kerno, who very quickly got back to me to say that they did indeed have material on the history of Kenegie and the folklore associated with it, and would I like to come in and take a look at it. So, of course, I had to go and see this for myself. So one day, a couple of weeks ago, I went into the archive to find that this quite substantial stack of material had been left out for me. It turns out that back in the 1930s, a woman named Anne Poole began researching the history of Kenegie, looking into the local ghost stories linked with the manor, and also trying to find out the origin of these stories. And that sort of blew my mind a bit. Here was someone approaching the subject from the same kind of angle that I was, but nearly 100 years ago. That was amazing. So I spent that whole day in the archive with my pencil, copying out all of Anne Poole's notes on the subject. So, alongside the early stories from the likes of our old friend William Bottrell. This episode is largely focused on the things that Anne Poole discovered about Kenegie, which, I have to say, turned out to be fascinating. So, without further ado, here's our next episode, The Ghosts of Kenegie. Old folks of Gulville say that, in their grandparents' time, the ancient mansion of Kenegie and its grounds were constantly haunted by 3 spirits, and on some nights, by many more. That was what William Bottrell wrote in the 3rd edition of his Traditions and Hearthside Stories, published in 1880. He goes on to say that the stories he heard about Kenegie came to him from an aged tinner of Lelant, whose mother, when she was younger, had worked in service at Kenegie. For those of you not familiar with it, Kenegie is an old manor and estate, which is now a holiday park, next to the village of Gulville. Just to give a bit of context and some historical background, Gulville sits right next to Penzance and overlooks Mounts Bay. It's a lovely little village with an old church and a fantastic pub that I highly recommend called the Coldstreamer, apparently named after one of the local Bolitho family who had served in the Coldstream Guards. In the medieval period, it seems to have been known by its Cornish name, and apologies in advance if I pronounce this wrong, Llanelli. Some writers think from the word lan, meaning church or holy enclosure, and Ishli or Isli, meaning low, so low church or church on low ground, presumably. The present name of Gulville, which people have used for centuries, seems to refer to a St. Gulville, believed to have been a 6th century saint. But there's still a little bit of debate as to who they were and the original form of the name, possibly Wolvela or Wolvela or Goodwall. There's a few different theories out there. According to Anne Poole, who was putting together her research back in the 1930s, Gulville wasn't mentioned in the Domesday Book of 1086 because, at that time, it came under this name of Llanelli. She says that at the time of Edward the Confessor, so going back to the 11th century, it was held by Bishop Leofrich of Exeter, who passed it on to his successors. It then passed into the possession of the Priory of St. Germans. Poole writes that the land seems to have come into the hands of a family called the Fitz-Ivos sometime between 1086 and 1186, and later passed to the Tripconey family, who held it through the rest of the medieval and into the Tudor period. Sometime around 1598, we're told that John Tripconey mortgaged Kenegie to a man named Arthur Harris, who was from Hayne, which is sort of between Oakhampton and Crediton in Devon. Arthur was captain of St. Michael's Mount and later became Sheriff of Cornwall in 1603. It then looks like the Harris family held Kenegie right through until the late 18th century, and they are really at the heart of many of the local stories and folklore. For whatever reason, this place and this particular family seem to have attracted a range of stories over the years, a lot of which were then written down later by the likes of Bottrell and Margaret Ann Courtney. Anne Poole writes, "The legends of Kenegie, told by William Bottrell in his book Traditions and Hearthside Stories of West Cornwall, surround the old home of the Harrises with an atmosphere of romance. which even in these materialistic days still clings to it. I think I'm right in saying that at the time that Paul was writing, Kenegie had already become a hotel. In fact, among the research papers was a letter, a correspondence with one of the Bolitho family, who seems to have been acting as a sort of go-between with the then owner. And it mentions the ghost stories and the folklore, and not wanting to make too much of it in case it proved problematic with the servants. There was probably this worry that the serving staff at the hotel might get freaked out if they heard these ghost stories associated with the place. So that suggests the folklore was still known about in the 1930s, but perhaps the then owners weren't wanting to draw too much attention to it, or they might have been worried about scaring away staff or guests. So, what was it about this house, and what were these stories that had become so well known locally that meant Kenegie had become a place with this atmosphere of romance, as Paul described it, and meant it had a reputation for being haunted? She writes that many of our local legends are only localized folk tales, but she feels that there must be some real events that triggered the stories surrounding Kenegie. She then goes on to write, and I love this, "And now I am going to tell you some of the legends, and what might possibly have given rise to them." She then goes on to quote from the original local stories. And this is where we have to come back to our old friend William Bottrell, who, along with Robert Hunt and a couple of others, is starting to feel like a regular guest to this show. He's important in this case because, as with a lot of the local stories in West Cornwall, he seems to have been among the first to actually write down and to publish these local stories and traditions. And of Kenegie, he has quite a lot to say. That quote I read at the outset mentions that the house and the estate were associated with 3 particular spirits, or sperits as he pronounces it. In his work, he goes through each of these ghost stories in turn, and I'm going to read through those as he's written it. The first ghost of whom there is any remembrance, and the one which remained longest, was the spirit of a thrifty old Harris, who made great additions to the house and walled gardens, and was most unwilling to die and leave them. This spirit, however, gave but little trouble. He merely came on a certain night in every year, which was known to his descendants, to review the place in which he had taken so much delight, and only required that, on the night of his accustomed visit, the principal entrance door should be left open, as well as one opposite, opening into a paved court surrounded by offices. At that time, the grand entrance was approached by a straight, stately avenue, flanked by a bowling green, with a picturesque 2-storied summer house or lookout at its further end. It was believed that any negligence in leaving open these doors at the stated time would be a cause of misfortune to the Harris family, or a token of its decline. Bottrell then goes on to say that this custom of leaving the doors open went back as far as anyone can remember, until within a few years of the time when the last Harris of Kenegie gave up his ancestral home. He writes, "'Tis said that when the spirit came and found the doors closed, through some mistake, it is supposed, he made such unearthly wailing till cock-crowing, then went moaning away and never returned." I find this really interesting because you get this sense of a family tradition, this ritual of leaving the door open on a specific night each year to invite in the spirit of this family member, this ancestor. And then on one occasion when someone perhaps forgets to leave the door open that night, of course that spells misfortune for the family. And shortly after that, when the last of the Harrises sells Kenegie, this event is tied to that, is associated with that. He goes on to write, "It is surmised that when the old family residence, in which he so much delighted, came into the possession of strangers, he neither desired to see it nor to hear of it again, and that he has, ever since, shut himself up in his family vault." That's the first of the ghosts that Bottrell describes, and seemingly this spirit is a relatively benign figure, coming to visit the house once a year, to have a nosy round, and to revisit the place he seems to have loved. There is mention of your typically Victorian, Gothic, ghostly wailing and moaning, but you get a sense that the ghost was basically just upset at the loss of the Harris family home. The next story that we're told is rather different. He says, "The next ghostly visitor, and a more troublesome one, had been housekeeper and a great favourite with a later Squire Harris, much to the prejudice of his son and heir. The very night after her funeral, disturbances began. The whole household were annoyed by this hussy of a ghost, prancing along stone-paved passages, from one room to another, doors clashing and banging behind her, till she entered the kitchen, where she would next be heard winding up the great roasting jack, one of the old-fashioned noisy clockwork machines, kept in motion by a heavy weight passing through the chamber floors, and attached to a rope or chain working over screeching pulleys fixed somewhere in the upper regions of the mansion. After an interval of scolding, shrieking, and the other accessories of a row, she would beat the table or dresser bed with a rolling pin and make the pewter plates rattle by way of announcing, as she was wont to do, that the roast was ready and to summon the servants to dish it up." He then goes on to write that the parlour furniture would be shifted as if preparations were in progress for entertaining a large company. This is all a bit different. We have this story of the housekeeper who has passed away, and then she returns, continuing to go about her daily duties and making a lot of racket at the same time by the sounds of it. You get the sense from this that it was much more like what you'd perhaps call poltergeist activity, with lots of audible phenomena and things being moved around. Next we're told, the shadowy figure of this old woman, in a long-bodied gown and kirtle, was frequently seen passing quickly through the court. Now and then it happened that a new servant, wishing to get ahead with her work, on washing days especially, and not hearing any disturbance, ventured downstairs in the small hours of the morning. But, on entering the kitchen, her light was almost always blown out, and she got a slap in the face from an invisible hand that made her see fire before her eyes, and, on turning to leave the room, received a kick behind which made her remember to stay abed till cock crowing. So this is where it all gets a bit darker, where we hear of servants actually being struck by the spectre of this old woman, which, well, sounds pretty terrifying. The next part of this story is particularly interesting because it ties into a theme that we've talked about before. The ghost of the housekeeper was at some point put to rest, or laid, as it's sometimes called, by ghost layers. We're not told who these exorcists were. Bottrell says all that's known is that they were powerful local clergymen. He goes on to say, as she absolutely refused to leave the place, they compromised matters by confining her to a small room on the eastern or northern side of the mansion. With her were placed a fleece of black wool, a pair of cards, a pole and kiggle, which is a distaff and spindle, and knitting needles. With these, she was required to card the black fleece until it became white, and then spin it, and knit stockings of the yarn. Here we have the ghost set this Sisyphean task, and this story fits a pattern very similar to other local stories in this part of Cornwall. There's the tale of Mrs. Baines in Penzance, which we'll probably look at separately at some point, whose ghost is tasked with spinning ropes from banks of sand. And there are very similar tasks attributed to the ghost of Tregeagle. So it fits into a local storytelling tradition linked with the idea of ghost laying. He finishes by saying, "Her closet door is walled up or plastered over, so that few know exactly where it is situated, though old folks who served the Harris family say they have often heard the clicking of cards in some remote part of the buildings." That brings us then to the third ghost associated with the house, and this is where we meet the character known as Wild Harris. This is what we're told. The last ghost of Kenegie, at least of whom there is any trustworthy tradition, was that of a spendthrift heir known as Wild Harris, who is best remembered because ordinary parsons' collective power was found insufficient to lay him. He extended his walks all over the grounds and far away down in the bottom towards the mill. He was also often seen on horseback, chasing with one hound on Kenegie Downs. Belated market folks and others dreaded to pass Kenegie Gate, or they frequently saw the squire's spirit standing in an alcove just over this grand entrance. The ghost mostly wore a steeple crown and feather, hunting coat and riding boots, or a long black gown and flat cap with lace and plume. He usually stood beside his family coat of arms, which may still be seen, and glared down on the road with a look as immovable as that of the lions carved in stone that, on either hand, then guarded the gate. Sometimes, too, he was beheld seated beside the churchway stile, a few yards further up the hill. Often, on approaching this spot, people were made aware of the spirit being near, though invisible, by a sulphurous smell which pervaded the place. On winter nights, the squire's ghost, with a dozen or more of his old comrades or such-like spirits, would assemble in the Bowling Green summer house, where they might be seen and heard from the mansion even, talking, singing, swearing and shouting, in state of uproarious mirth. Altogether, Kenegie must have been a lively place of nights, with the old housekeeper reenacting scenes of her former rule within, and Wild Harris's nocturnal carouse in the lookout. Few servants, however, lived there long. They didn't relish such ghostly merriment. Here we have, then, a different ghost again, and probably the most famous character associated with Kenegie, this man known as Wild Harris, who's described in the stories as a bit of a rake and who's obsessed with hunting and late-night partying with his mates. Wild Harris seems to be at the heart of a lot of the stories surrounding Kenegie and its ghostly reputation locally, with people being wary of passing the place at night. We're given a lot more information, though. The story grows, and in the tale, or drawl if you like, we're given Harris's backstory, and it seems that there was a connection with this character of the housekeeper as well. This is what he says. The other unresting Harris is said to have been an eager sportsman, with much wild oats in his composition, who cared for little else but his hunter and hounds, except a young lady, a poor relation, dependent on his family, with whom she lived much like a fish out of water, being regarded as too low for the parlour on grand occasions, and at all times as too high for the kitchen, where she was treated as an intruder by the housekeeper and her creatures. This unfortunate damsel passed much of her time in the pleasant upper room of the summer house, with old maiden ladies of the family, who here wrought everlasting tapestry, fine lace or embroidery, varying their labours by spinning to stretch their legs, and by doing much other useful and ornamental work, then regarded as necessary accomplishments. He later goes on to write, "When the poor gentlewoman was in her bloom, Wild Harris's father was a widower in his dotage, and too much influenced by his housekeeper, who had been, during his wife's lifetime, and was still, a special favourite with him. She ever disliked her young master, and detested the poor orphan lady, of whom she was jealous, fearing lest she might supplant her one day in governing the household. The dame was a malicious spy on the lovers, who frequently met in the summer house and retired walks down the vale. Their interviews were all the sweeter for being stolen, yet soon, alas, they resulted in sorrow to the young lady. The old gentleman was much prejudiced against his poor cousin by being persuaded that, only for this unfortunate attachment, his son would have wedded a rich heiress, whose lands lay near the Harrises' up-country property. He declared that the day his son married his cousin, he would wed his housekeeper, so that she should still rule the roost. In spite of all opposition, however, the young man would have made an honest woman of his betrothed, but was hindered by the malice of the old dame and his father until too late. For the poor damsel, distracted with grief, wandered away one night, she knew not whither, and next morning was found by her lover, drowned in a mill pond. Shortly after this tragic event, the old squire died, and Wild Harris found himself master of Kenegie, but disinherited of much other property bequeathed to his brothers in the army or navy. He had some satisfaction, however, in turning to doors the old mischief-making minion, meaning the housekeeper, but not much. She soon fretted herself to death, and was hardly laid in her grave ere she was back again, making such a din out of mere spite as hindered the inmates from getting a wink of sleep during the dead hours of night. The master of Kenegie became more reckless than ever. His days were spent in hunting or holding games on the bowling green, and his nights were passed in revelry. He kept open house for rich or poor who chose to partake of his hospitality. One and all were cordially welcomed. With all his faults, he had an open heart and hand, but in a few years he came to an untimely end, whilst still in his prime, by a fall from his horse when hunting on the castle downs. It is said that his horse was startled by a white hare that often followed him, and was believed to be the unfortunate lady's spirit. He was borne to Gulville Church and laid in the vault at night, as was the fashion then with some of our old families. His burial was attended by many friends, and when some of them, who remained late at the funeral supper, came down the avenue to return home, they beheld him as natural, seemingly as life, standing by the summer house steps, arrayed in his hunting dress, and by his side a favourite old dog that had died when his master breathed his last. So there we have the origin story, if you like, for the ghost of Wild Harris, and a few interesting things in there to talk about. Alongside the common things that you hear about in the local folklore, that Wild Harris was wayward and loved his hunting, feasting and drinking, we get this love story, this relationship with the young woman, a cousin, who has been sent to live at Kenegie. The housekeeper is cast as a sort of villain with this influence over the father, working to sabotage things between the two young lovers, and with these tragic consequences when the young woman, seemingly broken-hearted, is found drowned, either through accident or because she has taken her own life. This seems to be the turning point for the young Harris, and when his behaviour becomes wild, you get the sense that the behaviour of the housekeeper's ghost, all the clattering, banging and acting up, is partly out of revenge for having been thrown out when the young squire takes over. Another really interesting thing is the appearance of the white hair in this story, a theme that we explored in a separate episode that brings about the demise of Wild Harris and is thought to be the ghost of this tragic young woman. It's really similar to stories like that of Pengersic, who in that story is also thrown from his horse as a consequence. So it definitely fits into a storytelling tradition. I have to wonder how much of this story has developed and evolved over the years, particularly during the 19th century. The part about the tragic young lovers especially. It can make you feel a bit differently about this character of Wild Harris, who wasn't able to marry the woman he loved, and as a result became this wild and reckless character. That said, I have come across other writers discussing local variations, and in fact, among some of the research papers, one of Poole's correspondents says that they grew up hearing about a character known as Wicked Harris or Evil Harris, and they felt that the label wild seemed a bit tame in comparison. I've encountered other writers discussing stories that put a very different slant on the relationship between Wild Harris and the young woman. In some versions, we're told that she was actually kept prisoner in the summer house at Kenegie, and that in trying to escape from there, she may have fallen into the mill pond. That obviously puts a whole other slant on things and the perception of Wild Harris. His story doesn't end there either. Bottrell goes on to tell us how Wild Harris's ghost was laid. We're told that although the spirit of the housekeeper had been laid some years before, there had been unsuccessful attempts by local clergy to try and tackle the spirit of Wild Harris, but all to no avail. In the end, a Parson Polkinghorne of St Ives was sent for. We're told that this parson acquired the virtue whereby he became the most powerful exorcist and spirit queller west of Hale. This parson, in the stories at least, is described as quite a character. Bottrell says, and I quote, "From the little that is known of this gentleman, one may infer that he wasn't, by any means, such as would now be styled a pious character. He is said to have been the boldest fox hunter of these parts, but he would never chase a hare. Any attempt to kill one would make him swear like a trooper. He kept many of these innocent animals, the hares, running about his house like cats. Foolish people said they were the parson's familiar spirits or witches he found wandering in that shape. He was a capital hurler, and encouraged all kinds of manly games, as he said they produced a cordial one-and-all sort of feeling between high and low. The parson was mostly accompanied by his horse and dog, which both followed him." The next bit of the story is quite long-winded, so I've condensed things down a bit. We're told that a particular night in the later end of harvest was appointed for the ritual of laying the spirit of Wild Harris, and 6 clergymen, 4 from the west of Penzance, a young curate from St Hilary, and another from near that parish, all gathered at Kenegie to see what Parson Polkinghorne would do. Whilst they're waiting for this famed parson to arrive, a storm comes in, and they all take refuge in the summer house. Suddenly, there's a clap of thunder, accompanied by a misty vapour that envelops the summer house, and soon many of the buckadoo, literally meaning black or evil spirits, appear before them. And soon after, the spirit of Wild Harris appears. Bottrell writes, "Presently an icy shiver ran through them, and they felt as if something awful had entered the room. On glancing round, they beheld the apparition of a man standing with his back to the fireplace, and looking intently towards the opposite wall. His eyes never winked nor turned away, but seemed to gaze on something beyond the blank wall. He wore a long black gown or loose coat which reached the floor. His face appeared sad and wan under a sable cap garnished with a plume and lace. The 6 clergymen are terrified, but just at that moment Parson Polkinghorne appears. The tread of heavy boots was heard on the stone stairs, and Polkinghorne bounced into the room, when the ghost, turning quickly round, exclaimed, "Now, Polkinghorne, that thou art come, I must be gone." The conjurer, quietly holding out his hand towards the ghost, quietly said, "In nomine Domini, I bid thee stay." Then he turned to the black spirits, made a crack with his hunting whip, said, "Avaunt, ye buckadoo!" and off they went, at his word, howling and shrieking louder than the tempest. The ghost stood still. Polkinghorne uttered long words in an unknown tongue, whilst he drew around it, on the sanded floor, with his whipstick, a circle and magical signs, with a 5-pointed star to lock the circle. He continued speaking a long while without pausing, and his words sounded deep and full, as if at once near and afar off, like the calling of cleaves and surging of billows on a long stretch of shore, or thunder echoing around the hills. At length the spirit felt the able conjurer's power, crouched down at his feet, holding out his hands as if praying him to desist. Mr. Polkinghorne, whilst still saying powerful words, unwound from around his waist a few yards of new hempen balsh or cord, leaving much more of it attached. Having made a loop in the end, he passed it over the ghost's head and under his arms. Then, addressing him, said, "In nomine Domini, I bid thee stand up and come with me." Polkinghorne then locks the circle on the ground, and Wild Harris's ghost is led away quiet as a lamb. They head up to Castle and Dinus, stopping a minute on the hilltop. Mr. Polkinghorne said to the ghost, "There is no cure for a troubled spirit equal to constant employment, and I shall allot you an easy task, which, with time and patience, will procure your repose. But I must first make the whole of this enclosure secure against infernal spirits." Polkinghorne then goes on to perform a kind of exorcism upon the site to cleanse it, before turning back to Harris. "Now, my son," said he, turning towards the ghost, who stood near, "all within the castle's upper walls is as safe for you as consecrated ground. And here is your task, which is merely to count the blades of grass on this small space, bounded by the wall and the straight line from stone to stone, that you can always renew or find. You must reckon them 9 times to be sure that you have counted right." And that's where the story of Wild Harris, in Bottrell's work at least, comes to an end. Harris is tasked with counting these blades of grass at Castle and Dinus. Again, we have this theme of being set a Sisyphean task. And all of it fits in with many similar stories surrounding ghost layers from across Cornwall. It really reminds me of the stories surrounding Parson Dodge from over near Talland, where we have this priest who's clearly a bit of a character, and almost exactly the same phrase being used by the ghost of, "This priest is come, I must be gone." So again, all tying into local storytelling traditions that you can only assume have become interwoven over the years. Although Bottrell initially writes that there were 3 ghosts associated with Kenegie, both he and Anne Poole make reference to a 4th spirit as well. Bottrell writes, "A little while ago, an aged native of Golville spoke of another ghost that haunted Kenegie, but only for a short time. Whether it was the spirit of a Harris or an Arundel, he couldn't say, because it was so long past, but it was all in the same family. For a Harris, he believed, changed his name for that of Arundel. Then, over a generation or 2, the family resumed their former name. People round about always called them Harrises, and this one was spoken of as the proud squire of Kenegie. He always rode a high horse. If he met people in the narrow lanes, and there were but few broad ones in his time, they had to get out of his way by leaping hedges sometimes, else he'd ride over them. Now, when Harris the Proud was on his deathbed, he sent a man to Penzance for a lawyer, because he wanted to make an addition to his will. 'Take the fleetest horse in my stable,' said he to his servant. 'Ride for thy life, for thy life. Stop not for anything in thy road. Tell him to take thy horse and hasten away if his own be unsaddled.' Whilst the servant is gone, the squire's son, sat near his father's bedside, begins to weep, knowing his father isn't long for this world. But the old man consoles his son by saying he's going to gift him the estates of Trengwayton and Castle Hornick. He goes on. The lawyer, having arrived at the squire's bedside, and writing materials being ready, asked what must be added to the will. The squire, when propped up with pillows, gasped out, 'I wish, I wish,' several times, until he became exhausted and fell back in bed. After resting a while, he made signs to be raised again, and then only repeated the same words, 'I wish, I wish,' until the lawyer told him to stop a moment, and then say what it was that he wanted to have written. 'That my son shall have Trengwayton,' gasped the dying man. The lawyer, who had also been the squire's steward for some time, was quite confounded. In a minute or 2 he said, 'I don't know what you mean. How can your son have Trengwayton? The place doesn't belong to you. I can't understand it at all.' The little blood in Harris's body seemed to rush into his face and turn blue. Then he became pale, and cried as hard as he was able, 'Thou fool of a lawyer, not to know how,' when, unable to say any more, he fell back in bed, more exhausted than before. Then he began twitching at the bedclothes and kept on murmuring, 'I wish, I wish,' lower and lower, and slower and slower, until he breathed his last with the words on his lips. The unsatisfied dead man was laid in the family vault, when the customary time for keeping people of his quality above ground had expired. On the night of his funeral, towards the morning, doleful sounds were heard proceeding from the late squire's bedroom, with plaintive cries of, 'I wish, I wish,' followed by agonizing moans and groans. An interesting little side story there, where we're introduced to another spirit that Anne Poole named Harris the Proud, who was obviously worried about his son's inheritance, and seemed to think he had a claim on the estates at Trengwayton and Castle Hornick, though the reason for that is unclear. What is clear is that this fourth spirit is seemingly restless because the matter was not resolved before he passed away. We've looked then at the 3 or 4 ghost stories associated with Kenegie, and all of them have, over the years, over the centuries, become entwined with local folklore and droll-telling customs and traditions, probably evolving and developing along the way too. It would be easy just to leave it at that. Here we have an old estate in West Cornwall, around which many legends and stories have evolved over time. But I'm always curious about where these stories come from. Is it all simply folklore? Or is there something more to these ghost stories? And is there any basis in historical fact? This is exactly what Anne Poole sought to discover back in the 1930s, and it's where things start to get really interesting. It seems Kenegie passed between a few different owners during the 19th century, and according to Anne Poole, between 1875 and 1885, it was home to Sir Paul Molesworth and his family. Amongst the collection of her papers, I discovered some fascinating letters detailing some of the Molesworth family's experiences at Kenegie in relation to the alleged haunting of the house. The letters are signed Maud Wellman, so presumably they're written by her. They're addressed to her Aunt Fanny and are dated December 1893. They begin, "Dearest Aunt Fanny, curiously enough, I was thinking only the other day that it was rather a pity that no one had ever written any account of the ghosts at Kenegie, and now you say you want one. I will, this wet afternoon, write all I can remember. But so many servants have heard noises and had odd experiences that, unless I could assemble them all together, I could not really tell you half the singular things that happened there. On consulting my journal, I find on September 22nd, 1880, the first mention of noises being heard, and I have written, both yesterday and at night, Mamma, Blanche Wellman, now dead, who was staying with us, and Lettice, heard knockings all about the house. I had not mentioned myself, but I can quite well recall that I was sitting at the piano and noticed a great deal of knocking, something like chopping things in the kitchen. I ran downstairs to the little sitting room just below the drawing room and said, 'What are they chopping in the kitchen? The noise has been going on incessantly.' Mamma answered, 'That is just what we sent to ascertain, and they say they are not chopping at all.' According to Maud's letters, the family had been there since the autumn of 1875 and hadn't experienced anything unusual up until this point. But she goes on to write, 'After that autumn, we were never really free from these noises. Sometimes it would be a day or weeks before we heard anything. And then one would be woken in the night by the door handle turning and start up saying, 'Come in.' Or one would hear footsteps coming down the passages and stopping, apparently, at one's door. Kythe Molesworth St. Alban, when staying with us, asked me to sleep with her, because, she said, every night I hear noise, as if a lot of people came running up the stairs, talking and laughing, and burst open the door of the dressing room next my room. We're told that Kythe on several occasions would go to the dressing room, hearing a party of people talking, open the door, only to find it empty. This particular room was known as the Yellow Room and was supposed to be the haunted room. But it was in the pink room at the other end of the house where we're told that the presence, as they described it, was felt. Maud then goes on to list a few different people's experiences. In the yellow room one day, Alice, who was Letitia's nurse, was sat by the fire holding baby Morwenna at around 11 a.m. when she felt a heavy blow on her knee, causing her to jump with pain. She ran downstairs to the kitchen, where the maids simply laughed at her. We're told that 2 footmen in service to the Downings, who took on Kenegie after the Molesworths, gave up their positions because something in the night gave them severe blows over the knees, so almost exactly the same experience. And a man named Reginald Glanville also claimed to have been struck on his feet as he lay in bed in the pink room. A woman named Blanche Piggott stayed at the house in October of 1880, and afterwards she wrote to the family of her experiences in the pink room, and this is what we're told. The first night of sleeping there, in the pink room, I was suddenly disturbed. I do not remember if I had been asleep or not, and started up in bed to see right opposite, at the foot of it, a young man watching me very fixedly. I can give you no further description of him than that he was very dark and seemed to have rather long hair, like one sometimes sees artists with now. The whole thing disappeared in an instant at the moment I realized it. But it made that sort of impression on me that I feel as if I should recognize the face immediately on seeing it again. This was her only sighting, but she also described feelings of a presence, of breathing close to her, and constant walking up and down the stairs and in the passage outside. A Miss Morrison, on recalling experiences in the same room, also talked of a presence and quick, heavy footsteps, always at the same time, near 1 a.m. We're told that none of these guests were aware of any ghosts beforehand, but all approached the family afterwards, recalling their experiences. After this happened to 2 or 3 different people, they stopped using the pink room for guests. However, on one occasion, when a family called the Howells were visiting, they were obliged to do so, and a woman called Layla was given the pink room. Layla said that she felt someone leaning over her bed, and the feeling of someone else being present, along with noises in the passage and on the stairs. She also had a dream of someone coming into the room, and of a pale face lying on the pillow beside her. Apparently, she later drew a picture of the face and gave it to the family. She said that she was tempted to speak to this presence, but was afraid to do so because she dreaded an answer. In the end, one evening, she did call out, asking him not to disturb her, and promising to say a mass for his soul. After this, she wasn't disturbed again by anything near the bed, but was still aware of a general presence elsewhere in the room. Maud goes on to mention other experiences too. She writes, Mamma, for instance, distinctly heard in the night a sigh behind her, and Henry, who heard groans and sobs, and Lewis, who heard shrieks as of people being pursued. We're told that people in Golville always thought that Kenegie was haunted, and that the ghost of Wild Harris had been laid in the pink room. Maud mentions how it's interesting that there's this local story of the ghostly housekeeper giving people slaps, especially given the experiences of Alice the nurse, of Reginald Glanville, and of those 2 footmen who left. After the Molesworths had left, in October of 1894, Caroline Bolitho said that she and her sister found themselves locked in the drawing room. They rang for the footman, who informed them, speaking to them through the door, that he hadn't locked the door, and that, in fact, as far as he knew, it couldn't be locked, and yet somehow it had been, and from the outside. So there's quite a lot to process there. It's amazing to come across these experiences of alleged paranormal activity that have been written down and passed along to the family, and of the family's own encounters as well. A couple of things that really stood out to me were the accounts of people being struck by this invisible entity and of the sounds in the kitchen, all tying into those local stories about the housekeeper. And perhaps most vividly for me, this apparition appearing to Blanche at the foot of the bed in the pink room, and that description of the figure, this young man with long hair. It's tempting to wonder, was this Wild Harris? Equally, I find it interesting that the family hadn't encountered anything paranormal in the first few years there. The first mention dating from 1880. The same year that Bottrell's work was published, including all of the stories about Kenegie. Is it possible that members of the family had read Bottrell's work, and that could have had an impact? We have to remember that there was also a widespread Victorian interest in spiritualism at the time, so maybe that could have played a part as well. Who can say? We've looked then at some of the history surrounding Kenegie and some of the local legends associated with it. Then we come across these personal experiences surrounding the house's haunted reputation, and that starts to make you wonder, is there something more here? Certainly members of the Molesworth family, along with members of staff and guests, seem to think there might be. And whether you believe in ghosts or not, what really has me intrigued, and seems to have driven Anne Poole as well, is getting to the heart of these stories, and trying to discover whether there might be any historical basis for these legends and the characters within them. Towards the end of Anne's research, she puts together a summary, looking at each of the legends in turn, and presenting her theories for how they fit in within the actual history of Kenegie, and some potential candidates for these ghosts. The first ghost that we're told of at Kenegie was this thrifty old Squire Harris, who made great additions to the house and walled gardens, and was most unwilling to die and leave them. This was that ghost who was said to return once a year, and for whom the door was to be left open. Poole thinks that this story must be referring to the first Harris owner, Arthur Harris, who was governor of St. Michael's Mount. She says that the house that had belonged to the Tripconey family before, through the later medieval period, was probably by this point getting a bit old and a bit outdated and in need of refurbishment. The oldest part of Kenegie standing, at the time that Poole was writing at least, was Jacobean, so Poole thinks that this updating of the house and the walled gardens took place when Arthur was there. He lived at Kenegie from around 1600 until he passed away on the 16th of May 1628. He was buried at Gulval and was evidently very fond of the place. So he does seem like a likely candidate for this first spirit. Next, we come to this character of the housekeeper, the one making all the noise and the one who seems to go around slapping everyone. This is quite a tricky one to pin down, but in the stories, we're told that she had been a favourite of a later squire who was a widower, and that she didn't get along with her young master. Now, the only Squire Harris who was a widower was a William Harris, who dies in April of 1661. In the stories, we're told that when the squire died, the young master turned her out of the house so that she's basically left destitute, and that she soon fretted herself to death. According to Poole, in the local burials register, there are two possible records, two possible candidates that might fit the bill. I've had a look myself in the parish registers and found these same two people. We find an Olson Valentine, recorded as a spinster, and she was buried on the 6th of December 1661, so the same year as William Harris. She is also described as a pauper at this point. We also find one Elizabeth Harry, a widow, who was buried on the 26th of December 1661, also described as being a pauper. Could one of these two women have been the housekeeper mentioned in the legends? The story has her ghost tasked with this knitting in the sealed-up room, which is almost identical, as we spoke about earlier, with other legends locally. And Anne Poole writes, and I quote, "In every old house there are unaccountable sounds, made perhaps by the wind or by plaster dropping in the thick walls, mice in the wainscot, or leaves tapping on the windows. And as every house had a housekeeper of some sort, the ghost of one of them was held responsible." It's a good point, and I can completely buy the idea that families like the Harrises might tell these stories and attribute sounds in the house to, oh, that's the old housekeeper knitting away in a secret room. It becomes a great family story and eventually passes into legend. Now we come to, in my opinion at least, the most fascinating character of all, this Wild Harris. Possibly the most difficult character to pin down. And as Poole says, there is no certain proof of his existence. But there are some clues. In the legend, Wild Harris is the son of this squire who is described as a widower. And we've established that the only possible candidate for this is William Harris. He dies in 1661, as we mentioned, his wife having passed away back in 1656, so he does seem to fit the bill. Now, Anne's research tells us that in the baptism records for Gulval are the names of 5 sons of William Harris of Kenegie. We find an Arthur, born in 1630, who it turns out died in infancy. Then we have Joseph, born in 1632, Christopher, born in 1633, and then there's a William and a John. What's interesting is that for some reason, it's Christopher, the 3rd son, who becomes his father's heir, and who is later given Kenegie as part of what's called a deed of gift. Now, here's where it gets particularly interesting. Poole writes, and I quote, "I think that Wild Harris was probably Joseph, the 2nd son of William Harris, who possibly was wild and extravagant and got into trouble of some sort and was disinherited by his father." Kenegie apparently belonged to William Harris only for his lifetime. It was actually one of the estates in the hands of William's cousin, another Arthur Harris, who had chosen to base himself up at Lifton in Devon. But because Arthur didn't have an heir, as part of this deed of gift, Kenegie gets passed on to Christopher. Joseph then, at his father's death, found himself, as the legends say, master of Kenegie, but disinherited of much other property bequeathed to his brothers, so he doesn't get the estate, but his brother Christopher does. Anne goes on to say, he may have been killed by a fall from his horse and buried at night, a custom fairly general at about that time, and intentionally, or unintentionally, his burial was not entered in the register at Golville. She also writes of how unusual it is that Joseph is not included in any pedigree of the Harrises that she has seen, although the other sons are. So, was Joseph not only disinherited, but basically written out of the family? Could it be that Joseph was this wayward son who had gained something of a reputation, maybe got himself into some trouble, or there was some scandal, something that displeased his father to such an extent that he was disinherited and sort of erased from the family records? Poole speculates that it's entirely possible he might have had a hunting accident or something similar to that mentioned in the stories, but then talks about this low-key burial at night as being a general custom at the time, which seems pretty unusual to me. Though Bottrell says the same. He writes, he was borne to Golville Church and laid in the vault at night, as was the fashion then with some of our old families. So maybe it was an old custom, but to me it seems rather strange. Poole also says that she couldn't find any record for the burial of Joseph. Now, I had a little look for myself in the parish records for Golville, and I did, in fact, find a burial entry for one Joseph Harris on the 11th of September 1699. However, when I looked into it, it seems that there were two Joseph Harrises. One was the son of William Harris that we've spoken of, born in 1632, and the other was the son of another Christopher Harris, baptized in 1635. Perhaps the burial record then is for this later Joseph Harris, and that there's no record for the burial of the Joseph that Anne Poole is referring to, this son of William Harris and candidate for the character at the heart of the ghost stories and the legends. It's all fascinating, and family tree-wise it can get a bit complicated. But it also raises so many questions. Could Joseph have been the inspiration for this character of Wild Harris? Was he perhaps this wild and wayward character as Anne Poole proposes? If not, why is there so little about him? Why do the records suddenly disappear? Other than the entry for his baptism, he kind of vanishes. Of course, several centuries on, it's virtually impossible to know, but it does make you wonder. In Bottrell's version of Wild Harris, and in other versions of the story that I've encountered, his ghost is laid and set this task of counting the blades of grass at Castle and Dinas by a clergyman and ghost layer from St Ives named Polkenhorne. I had a look in the parish records, and I did find a burial record at the church in St Ives for a Reverend William Polkenhorne, noted as Vicar of the borough, dated the 28th of January 1725. So he seems the most likely candidate for our ghost layer. But other than that, so far, I haven't been able to find out much more about him. Finally then, we come to this fourth figure that Poole refers to as Harris the Proud, the man who wished his son to have Tringwainton. To explain this next one, we have to delve back into the Harris family tree. In the 1680s, the house passed into the hands of another William Harris, who preferred his estate up at Hayne in Devon, and so leased Kenegie to his younger brother, another Christopher Harris. Poole thinks that this character of the Proud Harris could be referring to this Christopher, who leased Kenegie and then when William died without an heir in 1709, the property actually passed to him. Like the story, he had a son named John, and this squire died in 1722. The legend tells us that he had undertaken many improvements to his farm, then in progress, as well as alterations to the house. Anne says the farm's architectural style is of around that period, so it seems possible it could have been built by him. She also thinks he took down any remnants of the old Tripconey house at this time and added things like the dining rooms. So he clearly put a lot of time and effort into managing and updating the estate. And he was also the first squire since 1661 to live at Kenegie all his life and be buried at Golville. Many of the others seem to have been to and fro their other estates in Devon as well. So what about this story surrounding Trungwainton? In 1668, Trungwainton was purchased from the Cowling family by Sir Francis Arundel of Menadava, which is part of the parish of Camborne. In 1721, William Arundel, last of the Arundels of Menadava, married Jane, youngest daughter of Christopher Harris. Apparently this last Arundel almost entirely rebuilt Trungwainton, which was sold in 1761 soon after his death. Had Christopher Harris sent him money for this rebuild? If so, when Arundel married his daughter, did Christopher consider the house as part of her marriage portion, and that therefore his son John would have a claim on it? Of course, we know nothing for sure, and the whole thing, as Poole points out, is mere gossip. But something along those lines obviously gave rise to the legend surrounding this character of Harris the Proud. We've looked then at the history of Kenegie and the Harris family, along with the local legends associated with the place. Drawing from Poole's research, we've even been able to look at some theories as to the origins of these stories, and actually find written accounts of alleged ghostly phenomena at the house back in the 1800s. When I first had the idea for this episode, it was really because I'd found a few little mentions here and there of this character, Wild Harris, along with a couple of other local stories. I had no idea that this would lead to a whole lot more, and that there was this virtual treasure trove of information. And that's all thanks to the fantastic work of Anne Poole back in the 1930s. So thank you to Anne, and also thank you to the team at Cress & Kernow for letting me have access to that research material. And, of course, to our regular guest, Mr. William Bottrell, for collecting those stories from that bloke in Lelant back in the 1800s. Kenegie continues to fascinate me, and probably will for a long time. Perhaps because there's so much history there, and of course I'm drawn to the stories and the folklore. And it's been wonderful to find the work of someone who took the same investigative approach, seeking out the origin of these stories nearly 100 years ago. And of course, these are only theories, but it does make you wonder whether there's a kernel of truth to them, and whether any of these people from the house's past might have inspired local legend. Who knows? These days, Kenegie has changed, becoming self-catered accommodation for visitors. And I'd be curious to know whether any of the local folklore and traditions have survived in the local area. Do let me know your thoughts. If you know any more about Kenegie, or you have your own ideas and theories, do feel free to get in touch. It'd be great to hear from you. You can email me at thepiskytrap@gmail.com, or you can find me on social media on Instagram and Facebook under The Pisky Trap. It's been a bit of an epic one, so I'm going to leave it there for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it and you found it interesting. I'll be back again very soon with a different topic. In the meantime, thanks for listening. The Piskie Trap is written and presented by me, Keith Wallace, with music by Elizabeth Westcott and artwork by Karis Harrington.